Welcome to the America 250 History Education Listening Session. I'm Val Crofts, a longtime high school history and government teacher, and now the Director of Education and Programs for the American Village Citizenship Trust. But I welcome you here today as a member of the United States Semiquincentennial Commission. It is an honor and a privilege to engage with professional colleagues from around the nation in this very important conversation. The Commission envisions America 250 as the largest and most inclusive celebration and commemoration in our nation's history, with the potential to inspire the American spirit, engage nearly 350 million Americans, produce more than 100,000 programs, attract billions in resources, and build to our peak in July of 2026. Today, we are going to explore just how America 250 can have a lasting impact on how Americans learn about, understand, and use American history. Our hour will go quickly. After my brief welcome, Brian Martin from the America 250 Foundation staff will give you a brief introduction to America 250 so that we can begin with a common understanding of the Commission's vision and approach. We will spend most of our time in a conversation with this distinguished panel drawn from a diverse cross-section of expert educators and facilitated by Tony Rucci, the president of the America 250 Foundation. You should know that this session is being recorded and may be released. Let me point out a few logistics to help you have the best webinar experience possible. Panelists will be seen and heard by everyone. Registered attendees cannot share their camera or audio, but we do encourage your questions, comments, and feedback throughout the question box in the control panel that our moderator will monitor throughout the session. One or two attendee questions may be elevated into the live conversation, but all will be addressed and shared with all attendees and panelists afterward. You will have an opportunity to provide additional feedback through the post-webinar evaluation that you will receive within 24 hours. We encourage you to view and download the handouts, which include pictures and brief biographies of our panelists to help you follow who is speaking, a page of technical tips for attendees, and a copy of this slide deck. Now, I will turn things over to Brian Martin, who will describe the Commission's vision for and approach to America 250.
So I'm Brian Martin, Director of Program Coordination and Outreach for the America 250 Foundation. And my task today is to provide a brief foundational introduction to the America 250 vision and approach. But you can learn more about the Commission's overall program by reviewing its report to the President on the America250.org website. The Commission's visionary framework consisting of America 250's purpose, themes, guidelines, and values aims to provide inspiration and direction for the big opportunity that Commissioner Crofts described at the outset. This vision emerged with remarkable consistency from the Commission's strategic planning process and was strongly validated by a stratified survey of more than 5,000 Americans. So let's look at our vision with purpose. Inspiring the American spirit captures the purpose of America 250 in a nutshell. Embracing that spirit within all Americans and each American signals our commitment to be broadly inclusive of our nation's many diverse communities and to have a deep impact on individuals. America's spirit is grounded in its founding principles that belong to all Americans. America 250 aims to provide inspiration for our continuing journey to align the American experience with the promise of those principles to form a more perfect union that secures liberty and justice for all. Our historic journey toward this elusive goal includes injustice, which we acknowledge and learn from as we strive to fulfill the promise of our nation's founding. The Commission believes America is on an extraordinary journey, well worth celebrating and commemorating, and invites your ideas and active participation. At the core of the America 250 vision are three themes: educate, engage, and unite. Represented here by the questions that conclude the description of each theme, they are perhaps better understood as prompts for participation, embodying both creative tension to unleash creative expression. They are also goals, which if achieved will contribute to the fulfillment of America 250's purpose. Today's listening session focuses on one element of the education theme, which reads in full: sparking deeper awareness of our founding principles, our history, and our democratic process builds broader appreciation for one another, our unique stories, and our common humanity. Together, these contribute to a better understanding of who we are, where we came from, and where we are headed. How will Americans learn about our nation, our institutions, and each other? America 250 is an opportunity to develop a deeper understanding of our past, to inform our civic engagement and encourage unity. Our four guidelines are meant to clarify the scope of America 250 for those developing programs by addressing common questions about the time and space encompassed by this monumental initiative. Today, I want to emphasize that America 250 is all about American history and America's past, present, and future. No doubt, America 250 will draw inspiration from and attention to the Revolutionary era. But America's story did not begin or end with the Revolution. It is a rich tapestry woven with unifying threads that trace both the triumphs and the tragedies that mark our effort to live out American ideals. Refined through expanding self-government and passed on to us by great sacrifice, these ideals remain the shared inheritance entrusted to us and future generations. Like history itself, America 250 is not just about the past, but invites engagement in the present and pursuit of the future. For America 250 to achieve its purpose, we must respect our common humanity, commit to passing on our shared inheritance and shaping our future, and assume and demonstrate positive intent to restore and build trust. To realize this vision, the Commission intends to facilitate a largely decentralized America 250 that is of, by, and for the people. Its approach is to create an architecture of participatory frameworks through which interested parties can shape their programs, ensuring that America 250 reverberates with many voices, speaking with one another about the meaning and promise of the United States. While the Commission will develop national signature programs and support national partnership programs pictured in the dark blue arrows on this figure, the vast majority of programming will grow out of the grassroots ideas and be administered through the four broad jurisdictional frameworks represented by the light blue arrows. The result will be more than 100,000 officially recognized programs, which taken together will constitute a wonderfully diverse and yet still cohesive America 250. The right-hand column in this table presents a rough estimate, largely informed by the bicentennial experience, of the scale of America 250 programming across the six frameworks. America 250 is unlike any other commemoration in our experience in terms of vision, scope, scale, and yes, schedule. That is why we're having this conversation now, not several years from now, when commemorative activities are more steeply building towards culmination in July 2026. Note that we anticipate overlapping phases of activity set against a backdrop of crescendo, culmination, followed by a natural decline, with some programming continuing beyond 2027. Among the challenges facing the Commission is its limited ability to influence this crescendo of activity and anticipate the tipping point of broad public engagement, which will likely occur around 2024 for such a decentralized initiative. Nevertheless, the Commission aims to minimize commemoration fatigue and maximize America 250's legacy. America 250 is a season, not a moment, and with the potential to deliver more perfectly on the promise of America's founding ideals. It presents a remarkable, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for history educators who we are eager to hear from today. Tony?
Thank you, Brian. And let me add my welcome to everyone on the call, both our panelists as well as our attendees. Whatever time zone you're in, it's either good evening or good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Let me be real clear. I want to get to our panelists as quickly as possible because that's who you came to hear, not me. Why are we having this as well as lots of other listening sessions? Because we want to have as broad an input into the design of America 250 as humanly possible. We need your insights, we need your ideas, we need your opinions so that we can bake these things in to the programs that we are designing. A little bit about our panelists. We have 16 practicing educators from the classroom, museums, libraries, the academy. You have the panelists' bios, and I trust that you are as impressed with the backgrounds of our panelists as I was the first time I reviewed them. So again, I want to get to them as quickly as we can. Just a reminder that the attendees, by looking at the right side of your screen, you should have a GoToWebinar control panel. And there is an item in the gray bar midway down entitled Questions. If you have questions or comments as I or any of the panelists proceed with their comments, please feel free to enter those questions. And we have a moderator who's going to try and distill some of those themes that come up as we go through. And perhaps we'll have some time at the end to answer some of your questions. So, Val earlier talked about what we're trying to do. How can America 250 have a lasting impact on how Americans learn about, understand, and use American history? This is not only, America 250 is not only a huge opportunity, but it's also a huge challenge. We know, and we'll be talking about this with our panelists in just a few minutes, we know that the historical literacy of the average American adult over the last 20 or 30 years has declined significantly. And we can't help but believe that America 250 could have a very powerful impact in creating a renewed interest and a renewed understanding of what has made America what it is today. And so again, we're going to immediately move into our panelists and our questions. I'm going to jump in by asking the first question. And I'm going to actually turn to Rex Ellis as the first person I'm going to ask to address question number one. Rex is involved with the Smithsonian Institute. So the question for you, posing to you, Rex, is in what ways can you envision America 250 sparking that renewed and much needed interest in American history? What are the best ways to build that interest both inside and outside the classroom? Rex?
Well, good evening, everybody. First, I'm so happy to be here. I think that one of the most important things we can do is to, as much as possible, personalize the history. Here's what I mean by personalizing it. I think that those we try to educate must feel as if history is important to them. And more often than not, they feel it's important if they think the history in some way touches their lives. History is always seen as something that happened to other people. It's never seen as something that happens to the specific individual. And I think that finding a way to make sure not only that they see a connection between their lives and the history we teach, but also seeing themselves as a part of history, I think is important. They are making history today. Their existence now will be history tomorrow. Helping them understand that they are involved in the historical process, I think is also important.
I love it. Personalize it. That's great. Thank you very much, Rex. Next, if I may, let me turn to Orlando Serrano from the National Museum of American History. Orlando, can you speak into that same question?
Sure. Thank you again to all the folks who are with us today, the fellow panelists and folks who are joining in and listening and hopefully asking us some questions. Rex, I appreciate the way that you sort of introduced this topic. And I, want to say that I concur. And as a former classroom teacher, one of the most pressing priorities was to create experiences that were both mirrors and windows for the students I got to work with every day, right? And what that means is we wanted, the team that I worked on to look for resources, to create materials that allowed the young people who we worked with to see themselves, like you're saying, in history, to just find mirrors, but also to find windows to experiences that maybe they're not as familiar with. And to extend a little bit on what you said and to build off of it, part of that has to do with the kinds of resources and curricula that are used in classrooms across the country. And one of the ways in which I think that this project, this commission, can spark interest is by looking for organizations at the grassroots level. I'm glad to see that you're going to be looking at lots of different organizations at different scales who are doing this important work of historical and civic education and participation, so that we can create a more inclusive US history. And I say that not to be nice or not to be additive, but because to be a good scholar, you have to be accurate. And that means creating more inclusive and holistic US history.
Orlando, you mentioned that one of the ways that you think this can be done, sparking an interest, is to adopt materials that really speak to the specific audience. Can you give an example?
Yeah, I will not shamelessly plug my own institution, but I will plug one of our sibling institutions. So the National Museum of American Indian has a wonderful suite of resources called Native Knowledge 360 that really does this kind of work that I'm talking about, which is, looking at US history, the history of the Americas from a different perspective that students oftentimes are not exposed to or familiar with in dominant historical textbooks that are used in classrooms.
Terrific. Thank you. Great example. And Donis, can I ask you that same question? Ways you envision how America 250 can spark this renewed and much needed interest in American history.
Yeah, I really appreciate Rex and Orlando's comments and echo the sentiment. I think these are the places and spaces where we can activate our young, speaking as an Indigenous educator, our young Indigenous people to see these places that are consistently viewed as colonized spaces, spaces we should not inhabit as Native people, as classroom educators, as museum educators, as public educators. And yet these can be places to be subversive. We talked earlier today in our pre-conversation about a lowercase e in my name. These are the places where we have an opportunity to activate those subversive tendencies that are there for our Indigenous and our Black, Indigenous, and people of color populations, our Two-Spirit people, that these are the spaces that they belong in as well. And I think that is one way to really spark that, and now, especially now in this historic time. And also, this is an opportunity in looking at the rollout of this time period for this particular project and into the future, that this is an opportunity to build sustainable relationships with Indigenous communities and tribes. And so we have that opportunity to do that on multiple levels, on a school level, on an administrator level, on an institutional level, and on a national and civic level. And so there are incredible entry points here to talk about Native people and Indigenous people on whose land we live our daily lives in present day terms, and considering what Indigenous futures look like as well. So it's very exciting and an opportunity to activate that excitement.
That's great. Thank you, Adonis. And Brian earlier mentioned we did a stratified survey of over 5,000 Americans, and by far, the most often mentioned favorability or support for America 250 was around hope for the opportunity to unite people in America. That was far and away the most consistent theme we heard. How could America 250 help unite America? And certainly education has to be a critical piece of that, right? Terrific. Thank you. So let me jump to one of the challenges I think we face. And so my second question, I am going to address it first to Kristen Williams. She is a teacher at Largum Creek High School. So Kristen, in the context of America 250, how can a teacher, how can an educator constructively encourage students to engage in important historical discussions despite the current climate of political divisiveness? Kristen?
Well, maybe I'm strange on this, but I don't necessarily believe that any issue is so divisive that it can't be overcome. And I feel like the reason why issues become divisive is when people don't have spaces where they can constructively engage in conversation about these issues, right? And so as educators, one of our jobs is to create this space where people can respectfully have a discussion about these issues that some might see as divisive or controversial, right? And so with this opportunity being presented, America 250, I feel like it really gives an opportunity to create resources that allow students the space to evaluate our founding principles and who did the founders represent, and have we been true to our founding principles, and evaluate these things in a safe space where educators can kind of guide them along, while also having those difficult conversations and maybe facilitating conversation between people who might not normally see one another's perspectives. And I think since this is such a celebratory occasion, it really offers an opportunity to keep it a positive, constructive conversation as opposed to an attacking or judgmental kind of conversation.
So, Kristen, you particularly emphasized how does the teacher, how does the professor create a safe environment for people to have these discussions? What's been your experience? How best to create that safe environment?
That's a great question. I'm very passionate about this, so I'll try to keep it short. I think the key is setting norms at the beginning and understanding that you can disagree with someone's beliefs without attacking someone as a person, and setting that standard from the beginning. And I say on the first day of class that anything that is racist, sexist, homophobic, or even, that is an aggression or a microaggression at another person, that's not what we do here. We're here to talk about the facts, and we're here to come together and make each other better, right? And I think if you start from that place, then students meet you at that place, and they will hold themselves to those standards that you've created.
Terrific. Thank you. Jane, I'm going from Harvard, by the way. I'm going to address that same question to you. How can an educator create and encourage students to engage in these kind of issues despite the current political divisiveness?
So I'm inspired by hearing Kristen. The first thing I was going to say is that all of us as educators need to find the combination of fearlessness and modesty to wade into hard issues around American history and our contemporary civic life, which are, of course, connected. I think historians in the academy evacuated this space in the 1960s, just when the history got hard. So we need to recognize, as professional development communities and as frontline educators in the classroom, that these are civic skills and historical literacy that we need to develop in tandem in order to allow our students to have vehemence without violence, to maintain opinions, but test them against a range of evidence, to learn that evidence literacy. And I think also on the occasion of America 250, to learn the history of the United States as a work of craft rather than as tablets that came down from some mountain, right? And a large part of that craft was coalition building, was vehement argument over principles, and then the fight to grab hold of those principles, as Brian and Val indicated, even by people who were excluded. We need to, I think this goes back to what Rex said, allow students to cast themselves in that ongoing tradition of refounding the nation through their own actions and through taking up the civic skills that the founders mandated of people who want to keep a constitutional democracy alive and bring it to a point of greater inclusiveness and the equality that Jefferson promised but could not live up to in his Declaration of Independence.
So Jane, you used the word fearlessness. Talk about that a little more. What does that mean?
I mean, I think we have to be willing as educators to wade in and be willing as curriculum providers and textbook authors to give teachers the skills. You know, we're talking partly about negotiating skills, which are a civic disposition, about coalition building skills, which a culture of canceling on all sides has ceased to sort of flex and believe in. So I think we need to give each other permission sometimes to be, I don't know, Kristen, you said safe space. I think we have to be safely unsafe sometimes in the ways that students advance arguments and revise themselves. And I think as we seek to unite, we have to find ways to do it without flattening or minimizing the differences among us, but to be able to air them respectfully, and always to go back to the sort of evidence-based evidence literacy that's essential to good history and to authentic civic participation.
Terrific. Thank you, Jane. And Christine Barron from Columbia, I'm going to address that same question to you. How can an educator encourage these kinds of candid discussions during a period of political divisiveness?
So when the pandemic started, I was in Manhattan, and in March I fled home to my home here in Beverly, Massachusetts. And one of the differences that became really clear was that, you know, the saying is all politics are local, but all pandemics are ultimately local as well. And that we have opportunities to see in our local community. I drove by 3 different protests this week in my town for 3 different things. So if we start looking at what is happening in our own communities and start asking questions about what's happening here, why, who built this, under what circumstances, for what reason, for whom, who was at the table, who wasn't, asking those questions close to home are going to ultimately be really important. And to the earlier panelists' point, you know, students are interested in themselves. We all are. Like, we are all interested in stories about ourselves. So starting local gives us a place to begin to ask the bigger questions. The fact that we are all now doing virtual education in some way, shape, or form also flattens things out, so that rather than sending people over to France to learn about France, we can connect Salem, Massachusetts to Salem, Oregon, and see the differences between those places and the ways in which they have constructed or deconstructed the same kinds of problems, so that we can start to see sort of the unity across these spaces, but then also start to talk about less about what our rights are and what our responsibilities to each other are, even if the only thing that is similar about us are the names of the towns we live in.
Terrific, terrific. Thank you, Christine. Okay, I'm going to move on to our next question about opportunities. I'm going to ask Geraldine from the Law Library of Congress to field this one first. How can history education promote better intergenerational communications? How can it build and strengthen family and community relations that help unite us? Geraldine?
Thank you, Tony. So working at the Library of Congress and seeing how people interact with history on a daily basis really makes you see how history education gives people perspective. And to Rex's point earlier, it shows people about other humans' struggles and victories, and it's in essence their own realities. So it makes me really think that people need to stop seeing the past as just this thing that happened in like an orbit and see it more as real people that went through real struggles and actually did real things for America. And I feel like knowing this and knowing this history education will make us be more empathetic and more kind towards one another, and teach us about inclusivity now. And in this, hopefully, people are able to understand how generations went through life in different forms and makes us more empathetic in itself. And hopefully that's the whole point of the American ideal, to be able to be empathetic towards people and be more kind in a way, to be able to fight the same fights together so that we can all benefit from a better America at the end of it.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, Geraldine. If I may, Liesl, same question from the Newberry Library. How can we use this to promote better intergenerational communications?
It's a great question. And I think I'm going to circle back to what Christine said about the local. So at the Newberry Library here in Chicago, independent research library, free and open to the public, one of the things that we do really well is local history, family history, including genealogy. And, I think as everybody knows, the local is really the national story. So I think in terms of families and intergenerational conversations and building connections across generations, including across political lines. I mean, I come from a big family in the Midwest. We do not all share the same political beliefs. What gets us engaged often is quite local history and talking about that. So, what did your neighborhood look like 50 years ago, 25 years ago, 100 years ago? What did your street look like, your town, your city? Why did it look that way? Who lived there? Were they displaced and why? What did they do? These kinds of questions are really, they're questions about one's own life too, to just circle back to what Rex was saying about the personal. They're really, really palpable in terms of walking outside your apartment, your home, and trying to then visualize what a place looked like that you see every day, what it might have looked like 100 years ago. We ask these kinds of questions during a year-long project we did around the history and legacy of the 1919 race riots in Chicago. And we went out to neighborhoods, specifically on the South and West sides, to think about what did these neighborhoods look like 100 years ago during that red summer? How have they changed over time? And we did that through an enormous bike ride, where we talked about kind of the then and now. And it was really, really powerful. And we had all kinds of participants, both young and old, right? So I think starting with the your immediate surroundings, your local surroundings is one way, I think, to bring communities together, to bring families together, to bring people of all ages together.
Terrific. Thank you, Liesl. And lastly on this one, Dwen from UC Davis, chat about how this intergenerational communications can improve.
Hi, so I'm here because I enjoy a good party, and we're leading up to a 7-year party, so everyone sit tight. I just want to say congratulations. We've already finished all that work here in California. We love local history, and we've been doing the hard work of digging deep. One of the most, it's a really, really exciting time for history, social science in California. We've had a framework, and it's been so much more inclusive than it ever has been. And for example, what we try to promote is that we should know our, can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. My computer is upset with me. So yeah, in California, give me one example. Cesar Chavez. Everyone knows Cesar Chavez because he's the farm worker who created a workers' union that improved the lives of all agricultural workers in California and then across the nation. Knowing your local population in California, we have the greatest population of Filipinos. And the unknown story of the farm worker movement is that Filipinos were the first to lay down their tools and say, "Not today," and they started the great 5-year boycott. And so I think that history is important because, you know, if you're a Filipino student and you never see yourself in history, you don't see yourself represented, and you don't understand like this great pivotal moment in state history and what will become international history is oftentimes told without your voice and without the voices of the elders in your community, you can feel left out and feel alienated and invisible. So some of that work is what we've been doing out here in California.
Oh, that's great. And it really does emphasize, once again, personalizing this for people, right? Terrific. Let me jump on to our next question. This is one of our challenges. How might we use America 250 as a memorable experience to inspire the youngest learners in America? The children who will be eligible to vote in 2026 for the first time are 12 years old today. How do we inspire younger people to with America 250 to engage in America? First, Val, can I ask you to address that one?
Sure. They have to care, and you know what connection they make kind of varies from my kids being taken to historic sites when they were little to my father-in-law, who was one of 18 kids, taking my kids to Iowa to show them around rural Iowa. Not that that's not always riveting, because it is, but the connection being made that this is their history, this is why it's important. It was something that when I was in the classroom, I connected it to why should my students care? How does it apply to them? And at the beginning of the year, I would ask my students, what do you want to learn most about? Who do you want to learn most about? And I would, throughout the course of my year, we would hit on everybody that they mentioned. So we're at a huge crossroads right now in civic and historic education. And we need to create engaging opportunities that are accessible to everybody. If a student can't visit a historic site, we'll bring it to them. And hopefully, America 250 is going to allow them to learn more about their country, which I think will allow them to internalize that and then to cherish it. And I think truly by cherishing our country like everybody here does, that is where we start to care more about it and we can become involved in it, which leads to more informed and passionate, civic-minded individuals who hopefully will carry that process out their entire life. So
Val, I love the idea of you having asked your students at the beginning of the course or the year, who would you like to learn about? Just, I'd be curious, what kind of names came up when you did that?
Oh, okay, good. It's easier if I do some of theirs. It was everybody from basics, you know, George Washington to Abraham Lincoln to Jimi Hendrix to Harvey Milk to Chavez to Tecumseh to just Frederick Douglass was part. So anybody that they mentioned, we would, I wish I had my list with me, we would have 100 to 200 people usually on that list. And they would all be touched on at least some point. We did art history, cultural history, music history. So I tried sports history. We mentioned the other day, we were talking about Roberto Clemente. He was on there. Jackie Robinson was on there. So from Wisconsin, so Vince Lombardi was on there. So most of the responses they had, I would say probably about 60 to 75% were maybe people we wouldn't normally teach about, but it was a lot of fun. And then they would call me on it. If I hadn't mentioned their person by the end of the year, they would remind me I was running out of time, but always made sure that I did.
I love it. Great example. Thank you. Georgette, that same question. How do we inspire the youngest learners to be interested in American history?
Well, I'm so glad that we're having the conversation about our youngest learners, because so often in that elementary level, we know that the marginalization of social studies has happened, particularly at the elementary level. But in looking at this moment of this commemoration, I see it as this opportunity to help and kind of capture the hearts and minds of a whole new generation of students at the very bottom, like at the very beginning. And what better way to send them on their path to citizenship and ownership of this thing we call America than to be a part of this commemoration. And I think a lot of that goes to helping their teachers, because elementary level teachers are specialists in 4 or 5 areas. And so they don't feel as though they're experts in any of those fields. So our ability to reach those youngest learners, I think, is through their teachers, and showing that elementary social studies teachers most assuredly should have a seat at this table in discussing and educating our youngest learners, because you can't take them to AP US history and you can't take them off to study the humanities and the liberal arts if they don't have a solid foundation and curiosity, which they are born with. So take this moment, take this commemoration, and use it to kind of revamp social studies education in our country today with more equity and more varied perspectives. And I just think that this is such a key moment and a fantastic opportunity in which to do that.
Excellent. Thank you, Georgette. Back to an opportunity. How can America 250 influence or most effectively provide educational resources and thereby have a long-term impact on curricula and informal programming? Can I move to Grace and ask you to address that one?
Yes, and thank you all for having me. It's a delight to be here and to work with you all. I think we have a really exciting opportunity in terms of providing educational resources that can have a really long-lasting impact. I think all of us feel that this is a historic time. At the National Council for History Education, we serve teachers, we serve professors, we serve museum educators, and I think all of them feel that this is a pivotal moment, and our members are all asking us, you know, this seems like the time to revamp our curriculum, as Georgette was just saying. This seems like the time. How do we make sure that our students all see themselves, as many of you have been saying? How do we make sure that all of our students are engaged, and museum educators as well? How do we make sure our audiences are all engaged, that they see themselves, that they're seeing parts of history that they've never seen before? What are the great resources out there? So I think we're sensing that this is really an incredible opportunity for all of us. And I would say that the most important thing is just the power of partnerships in creating these resources. This is for folks who are experts, historians, combining the power of historians and educators, education specialists, folks who are doing place-based history, folks at the Library of Congress and other institutions, libraries. Combining all those skills together in the creation of resources is incredibly powerful. There are so many of us working in history and doing incredible things that I think that this commission really has an incredible opportunity to bring that together. And that also, in terms of getting materials out, partnership is also crucial for that. And I love the idea of grassroots. There are just so many organizations working in history, and combining those kind of superpowers together, we can really reach an incredible number of teachers, we can reach an incredible number of museums, and thus Americans. We really emphasize professional learning, again, for educators of all kinds. I think professional learning is one of the incredible tools that we can leverage, and working together to make sure that professional learning hits educators everywhere. One thing we've learned in this pandemic is that having so much professional learning online is allowing us to reach places and teachers who maybe couldn't have traveled to professional learning. So that's an incredible opportunity. But what we're also learning is maybe there are pockets that don't have internet, and so we have to make sure, as we do move forward with professional learning, how are we ensuring access for all of our educators? So through a combination of both in-person and online education. And again, just the curiosity levels we're finding among educators and among just average Americans. The curiosity level about history, I think right now is very, very high, and there's just incredible opportunities here.
Terrific. Thank you, Grace. Mike, have we solved your audio issue?
Well, you tell me. I can hear myself.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. And I was about to thank Brian for, taking the bullet earlier for having himself muted. I want to dovetail back on what Georgette mentioned. One of the things that we need to do is to make sure that there's a link with elementary, with middle school, with high school, with college. Dr. Kamensky mentioned this in our meeting on Monday night, that we have to have a lock-in together. And that's vitally important, because so often we do sell short social studies in the elementary level, so that there is no foundation when they get to middle school, when there is no foundation when they get to high school. And it's just something that they don't understand. And again, in my state in Florida, they have no knowledge of anything prior to the Civil War in terms of formal education prior to getting to high school. Okay, so that's something that we need to do. And one of the other things that we need to do is we have to stop selling short the humanities. That so often there's this discussion about STEM, okay? And yes, STEM's important, but also is the ability to write poetry. So is the ability to be able to paint. And so is the ability to understand our nation's heritage, diverse and as complex as it is, and not to simplify it. There's always this talk about we need to go back to, we need an Apollo program. Well, we had an Apollo program. In 2002, we had the Teaching American History grant. I think we need to go back to that grant. And in the 10 years that it was in existence, it spent $1 billion. And that $1 billion was money well spent, because it energized teachers. And Lord knows teachers need to be energized now with all the things that are placed upon us as we attempt to do the very best job that we can, and especially in the middle of this pandemic. So I would say one of the things that we want to do is to ensure that there is the energy going to the teachers, who in turn can infuse that into their students, because the interaction between teachers has a marvelous power.
That's great. Thank you, Mike. Okay, our last question. And this is one of the challenges, and we alluded to this earlier. What do you think are the persistent factors that drive this chronically low historical literacy among the American people? And what kinds of strategies and tactics can effectively combat this long-standing historical illiteracy? Dr. Weinberg, Sam, can I ask you to speak to that one?
Thank you very much, Tony, and thank you to all of the people who are listening in, and to my esteemed colleagues. I want to respond to your question by speaking up on behalf of the good name of American youth. And I want to also invoke what Jane said about our need to safely inhabit perhaps some unsafe spaces. And your question has an embedded assumption, and I don't accept the embedded assumption of your statement, Tony. I think that if we're going to have a respect for factual knowledge and for evidence, I don't believe that you can adduce evidence to show that there has been a decline in Americans' factual knowledge. I'm going to give you a quotation. Ignorance of United States history shown by college freshmen. That does not come from 2015. That comes from your father and his compatriots, the greatest generation. That was the headline in the New York Times in April 1943, a time when Patton's troops had overrun Rommel in North Africa. We could go to a statement of Shirley, a grade of 33 out of 100 of the most basic facts of American history is not a record in which American students can be proud. For that one, Tony, we'd have to go back to 1918 in Texas. Think about who actually went to high school in Texas in 1918. What we have and what you're referring to is a consequence of a deleterious and an outmoded form of testing in which we trick students with distractors. It's part of a psychometric establishment. The sociologist Michael Schudson has a very lovely quote. Historical knowledge seeps into the cultural pores, even if such knowledge is not readily available by 17-year-olds answering a quiz. I think it's time to ask, we're making an inferential error. We say that because students don't know the things that a group of adults who themselves wouldn't have known those things are asking them, they don't know anything at all. Our young people, when given a very different way of displaying their understanding, we did this in a 2008 survey of all 50 states. We asked students who the most famous Americans were, important Americans, not including presidents and first ladies. And across the country, they gave us a very interesting set of names. The three most named people across the 50 states were all African Americans: Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and Harriet Tubman. Now we could argue about what it is that students know, but this idea that students don't know anything because they can't distinguish between 1776 and 1786, that is something that Google can tell us. What our students, if we want to engage them today, let them learn about history that is contemporary, that affects their lives. The history of poll taxes, the history of voter suppression, the history of gerrymandering, the history of Citizens United. When you go back and look at it, it is the history tied to the raison d'etre of Jim Crow. These are the kinds of things that are affecting young people's lives. They have deep tentacles in American history, and they will engage their interest and curiosity, and I believe make them feel that they have the power and the wisdom and the knowledge to actually change the course of this nation.
I love it. So, Sam, you really need to increase your passion about this subject, number one. And Brian, you didn't tell me one of the panelists was going to disagree with me. I would have had to reconsider the question before I asked it.
Well, I only did so because Jane told us to safely create unsafe spaces.
There you go. I love it. Good for you. And Leanne, you're going to have the last word, this issue of historical education and knowledge among Americans.
Yeah, so I don't disagree with Sam, but I do want to say that I think probably one of the biggest challenges, I mean, if we were to interview all of our neighbors and friends and talk to people who love history or people who say they never really learned history well or they don't like history, I would argue that those who say they don't like history or they're not interested in it, or perhaps they're the people you've described who can't answer certain things that we think they ought to know, I would argue that they probably learned history as a noun. You know, they learned dates, they learned certain leaders, they learned events, but they didn't learn history as a verb, you know, the way we did. You know, we learned history by digging into primary source collections, and we learned history by going to historic sites, and we learned history by talking to individuals who shared their experiences being players in events. You know, we had a different experience learning history. And I think that what this moment allows us to do is recognize that and provide so many opportunities for people to experience history as something they do, not simply something they're expected to memorize. So I could speak for hours on that, but I'm not going to. But that's what I think, Tony. I think if we think of history as something we do, I think we will be on to something.
Excellent. So, and again, thank you. I can't even tell you how much I've even gained from our discussion here. I hope our attendees feel the same way. One of the biggest things I took away from all of your input is this notion of how do you personalize history for people? How do you get it to the point where they see themselves in history and the implications of that for how they lead their lives, right? And the choices they make in a democratic society. And that came across in so many of your comments to me. So where are we? We're going to have to wrap up. We honor our commitment to be done by 7 o'clock. And I certainly want to thank all of our panelists and all the attendees for joining us today. We're still early in the conversations we're beginning to have, and we hope to have hundreds of listening sessions over the next 18 months about where we're going with America 250. We're going to use what we've heard this evening, as well as in the future, to shape what we do and the kinds of programs we hope to engage Americans in. We encourage all of you, and particularly all of you on attendees who are educators, to figure out how America 250 can factor into what you do as educators. Obviously, a paid political announcement. You can follow up by sharing additional feedback to us at listen@america250.org. And if you'd like to learn more generally about America 250, you can obviously go to america250.org. Our website is being built out, but there's plenty of information on there. What we're really hoping our website will do ultimately is promote dialogue with people who will be able to enter questions and information on our website. So thank you once again. As we keep saying, grounded in our core values as a country, America 250, we hope, by listening to people, is going to prove to be of, by, and for the people. And we hope those voices get reflected in everything we do. So with that, we will adjourn. I think we're done 1 minute early. Thank you all so much. And panelists, thank you. Good evening to everyone.